It's Monday morning, so that means it's time for a Triple M Footy news update with Tommy Browne. My name's Rudy. I've got Tommy here. We're going to chat through all the big news out of the weekend. The MROs in the spotlight, Tommy. The umpires are as well. Collingwood, naturally, we have to talk about them pretty much every day. And the Saints too, but let's kick off with the match review stuff, Tommy.
Yeah, big story this, Rudy. I nearly fell off my chair when I was about to go on air last night at 6:45. The match review results hadn't come through from the MRO, but I got some mail about some of these sanctions and went with it on air, and it's all proven correct because there's some big decisions. Now, Hardigan, who elbowed Walsh, received 3 matches. That was from some supporter vision, I think, in the Blues cheer squad. And what I noticed was the supporter had the peace of mind to zoom in on the actual incident. It was good mobile phone vision or whatever it was filmed on. Now, Nick Holman has received 2 weeks for that driving tackle on Mitch Duncan that left Duncan concussed. The Gold Coast Suns will appeal that. Lockie Plowman received 2 weeks for his collision with O'Meara. Carlton will appeal that. And Pickett received 1 week for that clash with Starcevic.
Marlon Pickett. Yep.
And they're going to appeal that as well. So there's 3 appeals at the tribunal this week. The broader question is the AFL's tough stance on these head-high and concussion incidents over the weekend. My understanding is you'll see more of these types of sanctions from the AFL going forward. It represents a change in position as such, and that's why they've gone so big, particularly on the Holman and Holman incident.
But what good, Tommy, is that crackdown if these are taken to the tribunal and then thrown out? And we've seen that happen already a couple of times this year.
Cunnington and Fritsch, both times, I think they were head-high impacts with an elbow and a collision. The tribunal has then gone against the AFL's initial MRO recommendation. So it's a test for the AFL, and now it's a test for the tribunal this week, and the AFL's review stance on this. So hopefully Steve Hocking speaks today and just explains, I guess, the AFL taking this stand over the weekend, because they are serious sanctions, particularly that 3 matches on Hardigan. I mean, that's interesting. It was an elbow. Walsh played out the game spectacularly well. So obviously they've taken into account the capacity for that or potential for that to cause injury. But the big one's Hardigan, because it was a driving tackle. Holman, I should say.
Yep.
It was a driving tackle where he was chased. Usually we're taught that these dangerous tackles are the slinging motions, where there's 2 motions, the sling and the sling again. That wasn't the case in this instance, although someone did mention to me that Holman's, sometimes his tackling does seem at the last stage drive the player into the ground. So the AFL clearly wants to protect the head. Duncan got concussed, and it's going to be a huge test case this week, Rudy.
From purely a fan point of view, that's the kind of tackle I think people want to see in the game.
Chasing tackles? Couldn't agree more.
Chase down tackle. I don't think he could have done much more. Like, I thought he exercised his duty of care. It's just very...
I think the focus will be on the final sort of half a second where he was driven into the ground. Having said that, these players, we've seen so many players, and I want to get to this, shirk tackles over the weekend. We're asking the players, aren't we, to tackle with more intensity, and maybe this is a byproduct.
Yeah. Well, also, it's sort of... Like I mentioned, the disconnect between the tribunal and the MRO, but the umpires are also... So Holman got a free kick for holding the ball.
He got a free kick for holding the ball. So in the umpire's view at the time, it was deemed an appropriate tackle that got him rewarded with a free kick.
And with Plowman, there was no free kick awarded as well. So I feel like the left hand and the right hand maybe need to coordinate a touch better, but you did want to discuss the discussion will intensify around tackles, you think?
Yeah, I think the discussion will intensify around tackles. It was a discussion point last week. Damien Harvick spoke about it. Alistair Clarkson spoke about it. A range of the coaches, Chris Scott. And I think it'll be a discussion point again this week, because there's just a lot of players now taking on the tackler and standing up in the tackle. We saw it in the Collingwood Port game yesterday in particular. I watched closely, and I think that'll continue to be a discussion point this week, Rudy.
Indeed. Let's move on. Speaking of the umpires, there was a very contentious decision late in the Melbourne-Adelaide game, which Melbourne lost by a point, a non-deliberate call against the Crows, which had a big impact, Tommy.
It arguably cost Melbourne the game. The AFL will review this today. I think they'll admit that it was an umpiring error. The Crow involved, whose name escapes me temporarily, was at the top of the square, handballed at about 10 or 12 metres at least, and basically there was no Adelaide player in the pocket. So that would have resulted in Melbourne at least getting a point to draw, or possibly, or more likely, a goal to win the game. Why didn't the AFL admit it was a mistake yesterday? They've done that twice already this year. I think they're just mindful, Rudy, of the attitude at the moment towards umpires. Some of the suburban leagues and junior leagues are struggling for umpires, and the AFL openly admit behind the scenes that some of their top umpires, they can't distribute them across all the games. So they sort of need to go into bat for the umpires at the moment. And I do think there's a bit of a skill differential across some of the AFL games And the AFL long term need to encourage more umpires. So they didn't want to come out and give them a whack again yesterday. But I think they'll admit technically it was a mistake today. Won't help Melbourne.
Nick Murray is the name of
Nick
the
Murray.
throw that has escaped you there. Now, I mentioned off the top, we can't go one of these episodes without chatting about Collingwood. Tommy, what's the latest there?
Well, the latest, obviously, from a Collingwood perspective, is they lost yesterday by a point. I think from a footy perspective, it was a much improved performance. There'll be discussion about the crowd. It was the Pies' fourth lowest home and away crowd at the MCG, fourth lowest since World War II, about 23,000, which is particularly low, and it was a good day, so you certainly can't blame the weather. The latest on talk of the extraordinary general meeting, a little bit careful at the moment, really, to comment on this, but just from a news perspective, I've been in contact with the guys doing that petition yesterday. They think they've got a sufficient amount of signatures already to call an EGM. And in their view, there was a strong push even from seasoned members yesterday for the members to get a say as far as the board's concerned. So I expect that discussion will intensify this week. There'll also obviously be discussion about Collingwood scoring yesterday. I mean, they sort of tried to strangle Port Adelaide, and it worked for a while until the last quarter. Again, does that come back to recruiting? Well, that'll be a discussion point this week.
Yes, very, very interesting every single week, the Pies. Now, St Kilda were arguably the biggest losers out of the weekend. Well, I mean, not arguably, they lost by 111 points. And Brett Ratton flagged big changes after the game. What do you make of them?
Well, St Kilda's in an interesting position because they recruited some experienced players, including Frawley and those guys, with a view to being close. Having said, I think St Kilda's internal view is they're still a draft or two away from getting some, or free agency away from getting some top-end talent. They got thumped by more than 100 points. Now, that's an outlier performance, but it was very, very bad against the Western Bulldogs. They had injuries on the verge of the season, which seemed to have gotten worse, but that's no excuse. And they just don't seem mentally strong, and that was a point basically raised by Brett Ratton post-game. He has flagged changes. He thinks there's some guys in the twos that are in form. They're clearly lacking depth to cover some of these injuries. And there's some interesting discussion I think Tom Morris has raised this morning, and I've previously spoken about Jack Billings on this podcast. He's out of contract, one of the highest profile restricted free agents at the end of the year. There's been no contract talks as yet, and maybe it might be in St Kilda's best interest to move someone like that on. Now, that's a complex discussion in terms of whether that's beneficial for St Kilda. But the point is, I guess they're not nearly as close as what some supporters thought. Having said that, they're working towards it. But they've got some pretty big issues, Rudy.
Must be incredibly frustrating to be a fan of that club. A finals win last year and then 3 awful losses this year at different points.
They had the rub of the green up in Noosa. That seemed to really suit them. And this year they had the injuries, and they clearly don't have the depth, particularly through the midfield with some key guys like Jones out to cover for that. So and they haven't got a lot of A pluses in the midfield.
The lack of effort is what would, I think, frustrate fans the most. But let's move on. Injuries you brought up. Let's discuss them. The big one, Adam Treloar.
Yeah, Adam Treloar's a big one this morning because he had a scan yesterday on his ankle, and then from the scan he went straight to see David Young, who's the surgeon at the Avenue in Paran. Now, the Bulldogs on Saturday night were hoping Treloar's a low-level syndesmosis. There's obviously concern. So the Bulldogs today say they'll release further details later. I wouldn't be surprised, Rudy, if he's already having surgery on that ankle. We've seen often once these players see the surgeon, it's often in preparation for surgery. So I don't want to jump the gun there, but I wouldn't be surprised if that's the case, which would see him miss some time. He'll definitely miss this Friday night against the Demons, which is a massive clash. So will Christian Salem, I think, because he went, the potential All-Australian, with Melbourne across to Adelaide over the weekend. He was held over, and whilst Melbourne's reluctant to say what his general soreness is, I think it could be a groin complaint, so we might see him miss a little bit of footy as well. Speaking of some other injuries, James Frawley had a scan, I think, on his shoulder yesterday morning, the St Kilda veteran. I think he's okay. Toby Green, it's already been reported that he's got this fractured shoulder and he'll miss around 4 weeks. I'm told it'll be at least 4 weeks. I know some people that ran into him over the weekend. I think it's definitely not a good injury. Tim English, an interesting one, expected to come back for the Bulldogs this week from his concussion. There was some mail doing the rounds for some players over the weekend I was speaking to or heard through, more accurately, that English might have had a facial fracture that the Bulldogs were hiding. But I went straight to the Bulldogs yesterday and they're adamant that it wasn't a facial fracture. They've hid nothing and it's just been concussion or related to that head knock the whole time. Either way, I think he's expected back this week.
He did have a long time off and was a very heavy hit on his head.
It definitely was. Mason Cox, an interesting one, in at Collingwood this morning. He suffered that knock to the larynx last week during training. Had to be taken to the Epworth by ambulance. He was cleared, obviously, got out of hospital, but he still can't talk properly. So it just shows you he's had some weird injuries, Mason Cox. There was, I think, both eyes, or at least one eye, that saw him had to sit in a dark room for a while and have eye surgery. Now he's had this can't talk throat knock, and that's not ideal.
Well, however he got hit, they've done pretty well to get up that high to his throat. He's a very, very big man.
That's very true.
All right, so I think we're just about done here, but the big three sort of talking points from tonight.
Yeah, the big three tonight will obviously be Collingwood and these off-field issues now. When I say off-field issues, the push, I guess, from the members for an extraordinary general meeting to have a say on the board. I think that could even step up in terms of some news on that today. As soon as today, they're close to getting that EGM up, and they will be by the end of the week, particularly online. St Kilda and their performance, that's a big discussion point about where they're at and what they need to do in regards to their list. A lot was made of their list. They brought in special recruiters to bring in specific players like Brad Hill, and there's going to be some big discussion around that. And also the MRO and this very strict interpretation the AFL's adopted over the weekend, Rudy. And I guess what was the shift? What was the change? Why did the AFL do that over the weekend? Why did Steve Hocking makes the decisions. The MRO, Chriso's influential, but Steve Hocking makes the decisions, and it'll be interesting to see what he says regarding their interpretation and stance on concussion. Having said all that, we need to protect the head, and I think the AFL knows it.
So a massive news week ahead, Tommy. You'll be back Wednesday morning with me, and we'll run through the fallout of what's going to be a huge couple of days.
Can't wait, Rudy.
Thanks for coming in. We'll see you then.